Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. In July 1996, 4 German tourists decided to embark on the most unforgettable journey of their lives. Egbert Rimkus, Cornelia Meyer, Max Meyer, and Georg Weber left Las Vegas and headed towards Death Valley National Park in California. On a hot summer day, none of them could predict what was about to unfold. Their plans were quite simple: to explore Death Valley and experience the unforgettable nature of one of the hottest and most mysterious places in the world. Death Valley, as its name suggests, seems like a place where death waits. But for the group, this was an adventure. Cornelia and Egbert, a couple in love, were the driving force behind the journey, taking each other on big trips. Max, Cornelia's son, shared the excitement of the trip with his mother. Georg, Egbert's son, was a young boy, and this trip was expected to be both fun and educational for the children. What should have been a simple vacation would lead them to a mysterious end. Unaware of the challenges in the region, the group was searching for a campsite near Anvil Canyon. This area is one of the most famous and isolated parts of Death Valley. That night, the temperature would rise to around 45 degrees, presenting a tough physical and mental test for the group. However, throughout the journey, none of them ever considered turning back. Their trust in one another was unwavering. Egbert's guiding role and Cornelia's positive attitude motivated the group. As they continued along their journey, they knew there were more places to discover. But there was a problem. The temperatures in Death Valley were rising rapidly, and with it, the roads were becoming increasingly dangerous. This region had gained a notorious reputation for being a perilous desert where dozens of people went missing every year. Without finding a place to spend the night, they became lost near Anvil Canyon. The car veered off course, and at some point, their journey took a wrong turn. Despite sensing the danger, none of them fell into despair. They viewed it as just a small deviation. Yet, over time, that small deviation would turn into a dead end. However, there was something that everyone in the group would remember and never forget that night: the fear of being lost in the middle of the desert. No guidebook, no map, and no companion could predict this moment. On the road, in the silence stolen by the hot wind, there was only one thought: everything would be all right. But before the journey turned into a fight for survival, no one realized that they wouldn't be coming back. These people, lost in a legendary desert, would feel the full force of nature's relentless power. The road would ultimately lead to their mysterious disappearance and entrapment in the depths of the desert. Georg and Max, trusting each other, would further strengthen their bond. But at such a strong point of trust, no one realized how vulnerable they truly were. The plans to spend the night at the campsite slowly faded into an unreachable dream, while the hot and dry desert roads were merely the first steps of the group's survival struggle. From the moment they got lost, nothing would ever be the same again. And that night, they unknowingly took one more step into Death Valley. On the morning of July 12, 1996, an abandoned Dodge minivan was found in the barren lands of Death Valley. This was the vehicle where Egbert Rimkus and his friends began their journey, but it was also the beginning of a disaster. The minivan was found on the side of the road, surrounded by sand in a secluded area. Upon entering, everything appeared normal at first glance. Luggage was in place, passports and personal items were not missing. However, one detail stood out: there was no one inside. The team began their investigation around the area where the minivan was found. The vehicle, symbolizing a long journey, had been abandoned here. The surrounding sand and environment carried the traces of a life that once existed in this area. At one time, a group of people had been full of life here, but now only abandoned belongings, and an unsettling silence remained. Inside the minivan, there were bags, film rolls, and passports belonging to the group members. These items, filled only with reminders of their journey, would soon turn into a question mark for the war authorities. Because another detail would soon be noticed: there were no traces inside the minivan. No footprints, no records, not the slightest clue about the missing individuals. This disappearance was not an ordinary one. No trace of the missing could be found. There were no footprints around the vehicle, no phone signals, not even a simple sign. Soon after, authorities launched an extensive search operation at the scene. With each passing hour, the mystery deepened. Everything the missing tourists had left behind made the questions even more complicated. However, the findings related to the abandoned minivan at the roadside failed to convince anyone. Initially, it was considered a criminal case, but the first analyses and investigations indicated that the missing people had randomly stumbled into this area. At first, authorities considered the possibility that the missing tourists had vanished under suspicious circumstances, but the absence of any traces inside the vehicle and the fact that everything was in its place suggested that the disaster had taken a different turn. This called for a more thorough investigation. Nothing seemed to explain the sudden disappearance of the tourists. Search teams began scouring the vast area, extending deep into the desert. Helicopters, thermal cameras, and search dogs examined every inch of the region. In the heat of the desert, it was extremely difficult to find any trace of the missing individuals. Since not even a single trace of the travelers could be found, it demoralized the search teams. The void was so large that the question arose, had they gotten lost in the riverbed, among the rocks, or on the sand dunes? The heat of the desert and sandstorms made the investigation nearly impossible. For an entire day, all routes surrounding the area where the tourists had disappeared were thoroughly searched. Not only the area where the minivan was found, but also the nearby surroundings were carefully examined. Yet there was no sign of the missing individuals. As time passed, both the authorities and volunteers continued to endure the harsh conditions of Death Valley, but they found no results. By the end of the search efforts, no one knew which route the missing had taken, where they went, or how long they had survived. As the days passed, hope began to fade. Security cameras, phone signals. Nothing was left behind by the missing. There was no evidence that the tourists had disappeared. The passage of time only deepened the complexity of the case, as every clue had vanished, every trace erased. The story of these 4 tourists lost in the middle of the desert had now become a mystery. Death Valley, a place that shows nature's ruthless power against humans, had slowly erased the traces of these 4 people when they disappeared. The end of their journey became more complex and controversial with each passing day. It was clear that more effort would need to be put in to track down the missing. Yet, this disappearance led straight into the unknown. Reality had been replaced by an enigma. On July 12, 1996, after the disappearance of the 4 German tourists, the authorities, who were mobilizing to begin search efforts in Death Valley, were met with many challenges. This desert region, with its harshest and most unforgiving conditions, made it almost impossible to find the missing. With temperatures reaching 50 degrees, sandstorms, poor visibility, and rough terrain, the search became nearly impossible. The search team first tried aerial surveys using helicopters. The barren landscape, with its sparse vegetation and sand dunes, became a scene that left no trace when viewed from the air. However, the cameras of the helicopters, hovering a few hundred meters above the ground, showed no signs either. The vastness of the desert not only caused the missing tourists' traces to be lost, but also created an emptiness that demoralized the volunteers. On the ground, local search teams used volunteer dogs. These dogs tried to track the scent of the missing. However, in the desert heat and sandy environment, even the dogs' scent-tracking abilities were pushed to their limits. The failure of the dogs to find anything further deepened the team's frustration. The sand became a barrier that, swallowed everything. After days of effort, the searchers and dogs could find not even the slightest trace of the missing individuals. This search, in fact, becomes a battle against the conditions. The nature of Death Valley presents a tough test for the team, both physically and psychologically. The high temperatures, the intense heat of the sand sinking deep into the ground, and the rare winds demoralize the team with each passing day. During the search, no trace can be found around the secret area where the minivan was located, along with the surrounding sand dunes. Some locals, recalling the natural obstacles in the area, suggest various possibilities for how the tourists might have gotten lost. However, the theories become more complex rather than leading to a clear conclusion. Initially, the search teams begin to formulate theories about which direction the missing people may have gone after abandoning the minivan. Some theories suggest that the tourists may have tried to walk to higher ground, but the desert's conditions indicate that such a movement would be almost impossible. Another theory is that the tourists may have gotten out of the vehicle and searched for a nearby water source. However, such water sources are rare in the region, and the shifting sands obscure any clear visibility of water sources. The team hypothesizes that the missing tourists may have headed toward a more restricted area near Anvil Canyon. This theory makes sense considering the hot desert air and rocky terrain, but no footprints or any other signs of the missing individuals are found. The search becomes increasingly uncertain. Another prevalent theory is that the tourists may have been completely lost due to the sandstorms. Even short sandstorms can drastically alter the environment, causing the physical traces of the area where the tourists disappeared to vanish. In the desert heat, survival in such storms is nearly impossible. However, although this theory initially seems plausible, how all the missing individuals could have lost their traces so quickly remains unclear. Volunteers involved in the search become increasingly exhausted. The team scanning the depths of the desert under the sun's blazing heat stay awake, not knowing what the next day will bring. Rising temperatures and demanding conditions take a severe toll on the morale of the team. Many volunteers begin to consider the possibility that the missing tourists are no longer alive, while others believe that their chances of survival in such conditions are now negligible. Gradually, the authorities are forced to narrow down the search efforts to a smaller area. Only extensive helicopter surveys and tracking on hiking routes continue. However, with each passing day, the disappearance of the missing tourists deepens the mystery of the region's nature. The harsh weather and uncertain conditions continue to keep the real journey of the missing tourists hidden. The arms of Death Valley are vast enough to encompass any area where the tourists may have gone missing. However, with each passing hour, the search to follow the unseen traces of the missing deepens. Still, the desert's secrets grow more mysterious with every minute. On July 13, 1996, the efforts to trace the 4 missing German tourists officially end on the 6th day. The lack of results from the prolonged search in such difficult conditions pushes the authorities into a deep impasse. In this desert region, where temperatures reach 50 degrees, the helicopter and search dog efforts fail to find the slightest trace of the missing. The extreme heat limits the flight duration of the helicopters, and the physical capacity of the ground team is exhausted. Sandstorms and reduced visibility have made the search nearly impossible. The fate of the 4 missing people in these harsh conditions remains unresolved. In the final investigations, it is acknowledged that the missing 4 tourists were vulnerable to the deadly dangers posed by the natural conditions. The hot desert air, declining oxygen levels, and limited water sources reduce the chances of survival to nearly zero. The desert is known as a place where dozens of tourists or travelers crossing the desert go missing or die every year. But the investigation into this disappearance is quite different from other cases. When the official search ends, it is confirmed that the missing tourists have met with disaster. However, sadly, no bodies or any other points of contact remain. Only their abandoned minivan and a few photographs from those days remain as the only things that remind us of the missing 4. The fate of the 4 people lost in this area of Death Valley remains a mystery, buried deep in the desert's depths. After the official end of the search, media attention surrounding the case rapidly diminished. Initially, the mystery of the missing tourists had captured the public's interest, and various theories had emerged. However, as the search and investigation progressed, media coverage gradually faded. Local newspapers, television stations, and radio stations ceased their broadcasts about the incident. The government acknowledged that the deaths of the missing tourists were due to natural causes, yet this conclusion still left many unanswered questions. The harsh conditions of the desert made it almost impossible for the missing individuals to have survived, and many believed that the true facts behind the disappearance would never be fully uncovered. In time, the disappearance became remembered only as a local tragedy. The names of Egbert Rimkus, Cornelia Meyer, Max Meyer, and Georg Weber began to fade into obscurity. The dark veil surrounding the incident could never be fully lifted. While Death Valley continued to claim the lives of new tourists each year, the disappearance of these 4 tourists was buried in history as the result of natural conditions. However, a complete explanation for their disappearance still remained elusive. As time passed, the disappearance of the 4 German tourists lingered in the memories as a mysterious case. Many questions still remained unanswered about the tourists who had vanished in Death Valley. Their passports, rolls of film, and luggage remained the only evidence that they had once been there. However, the exact time and circumstances of their disappearance were never clearly understood. Many people speculate that the tourists perished while trying to reach a water source just a few kilometers away under such harsh conditions. Nevertheless, the mystery remains unsolved. In the depths of Death Valley, the tragedy of these 4 missing tourists continues to stand as a testament to the deadly forces of natural disasters and nature's relentless power over humans. The fact that the bodies of the missing were never found raises new questions about why the search initiated at the time failed. Yet despite years of uncertainty, the unanswered questions and the memories of the lost travelers remain a mystery in Death Valley. Over time, the mystery of the 4 missing German tourists has been largely forgotten as the years went by. However, their memory remains, hidden in the secret corners of the desert, a sorrow that has never been solved throughout history. By 2009, the mystery of the 4 German tourists who went missing in Death Valley remained unresolved for 13 years. After the search efforts concluded in 1996, media interest and official investigations had quickly diminished, but some volunteer researchers and relatives of the missing tourists continued to pursue leads. Among them, 2 individuals, Tom Mahood and Les Walker, decided to revisit the case years later. As volunteer researchers, they began their search for clues again, but this would be no easy journey. Mahood and Walker, during their search efforts, decided to venture into the remote corners of the desert to follow the missing tourists' possible routes. The southeast region of Death Valley, an isolated area, is usually not well known to many. However, thinking about the possible routes the missing tourists may have taken years ago, they focused their attention on this area. One morning, their new discovery in search of the missing tourists would mark a pivotal moment. 13 years later, Mahood and Walker uncover some personal belongings and human remains in one of the untouched corners of Death Valley. This discovery is a crucial turning point. After years of uncertainty, it is the first concrete evidence of the missing tourists. The area discovered by Mahood and Walker is miles away from where the minivan was abandoned. In a hidden corner of the desert, they find some of the missing tourists' personal items: a pair of shoes, several rolls of film, and a passport. Questions arise about how deteriorated these items are and how long they have remained in the harsh desert conditions. However, these objects represent a significant find for the researchers attempting to trace the missing tourists. Additionally, several human remains are found. The bone fragments found offer clues that they may belong to one of the missing individuals. While these findings do not definitively indicate that death has occurred, they suggest that the struggle for survival in the desert's harsh conditions was incredibly difficult. The remains found in the middle of the desert marked an important step in understanding the scale of the events that befell the missing tourists. From the very first day the 4 tourists went missing, surviving under the conditions of Death Valley's desert was incredibly difficult. Temperatures had risen to 50 degrees C, and oxygen levels were extremely low. However, the remains and belongings uncovered by the volunteer researchers show that the missing tourists fought an incredibly tough battle for survival. A desert without water sources can make survival impossible. Yet, some of the items found suggest that the missing tourists may have tried to develop various survival strategies. The inadequacy of their clothing and materials may have made their conditions even harder. Their efforts to travel for several days, followed by exhaustion and likely dehydration, would have reduced their chances of survival to nearly zero. While the discovered belongings and remains offer crucial clues about the causes of their deaths, the biggest question remains unanswered. Where did the 4 missing tourists go? Although the volunteer researchers continued to investigate the tourists' last routes, the discovery in this isolated region of the desert has not yet provided answers to the exact circumstances of their disappearance. Whether the tourists made the decision to keep moving during their survival struggle, as suggested by the findings, remains a matter of doubt. Some theories suggest that the tourists may have ventured deeper into the desert on their own. However, given the extremely dangerous and obstructive nature of the desert, this seems unlikely. The locations where the belongings were found suggest that the missing tourists might have traveled to a more distant area in search of a last glimmer of hope. But whether this was logical is contradicted by the necessary actions for survival in such conditions. The discovery made by Mahood and Walker, 13 years later, sheds new light on the mystery of the 4 missing German tourists. But many unanswered questions still remain. The harsh conditions of the desert made the tourists' struggle for survival even more tragic, and the question of what they did to survive remains unanswered. The last known locations of the missing, the clues that can be drawn from the discovered belongings, only reveal a portion of this tragedy. The reasons behind this disappearance remain shrouded in the deadly desert conditions, survival efforts, and the mysterious secrets of the desert. Whether their deaths occurred due to the effects of the physical conditions or for some other reason is not definitively known. Although this discovery made years later brought researchers one step closer to the truth, the mystery remains unsolved. For 13 years, the story of the 4 missing German tourists remained like a lost junction point within the deadly desert. Death Valley, one of the hottest and driest places on Earth, relentlessly tests human survival instincts. This harsh nature forces people to either survive or perish. The discovery made by Tom Mahood and Les Walker in 2009 was a step that illuminated the tragic end of the missing tourists, but also pointed to a great unknown. Mahood and Walker tried to understand the journey the missing tourists undertook and the conditions under which they fought for survival, based on the human remains and personal items they found. The personal belongings found, such as rolls of film, shoes, and passports, revealed that even in their final moments, the tourists, in a world where they had disappeared and lost hope, had still considered some basic survival necessities. 3. Analysis of the remains indicates that the tourists could not withstand the lethal exhaustion caused by temperature and dehydration. The remains found bear the marks of a prolonged survival struggle, symbolizing their final efforts. Despite facing the harshest conditions, the missing tourists did not spare their efforts to survive. However, the deadly desert conditions completely exhausted their chances of survival. Death Valley presents the most fundamental tests of human nature. Extreme temperatures, lack of water, and overexertion were among the main factors that made the tourists' final struggle even harder. There is no doubt that towards the end of their journey, the missing tourists must have become increasingly reliant on each other, expending their final efforts to survive with every passing minute. However, in the end, the scorching temperatures and dehydration forced them to bid farewell to life. The remains found in the desert highlight just how desperate humans can become in such harsh environments and how merciless nature can be. Death Valley stands as a stark reminder of how nature can push humans to their natural limits, offering them a brutal survival experience. Despite the years that have passed, the true story of the missing tourists remains not just a case of people lost to the desert, but a part of humanity's encounter with nature's relentless power. These 4 tourists symbolize how human boundaries are tested, and how nature in all its strength confronts humanity. This mysterious and dangerous desert pushed them to the very limits of their survival struggle. Many have tried to interpret this story in an effort to understand the tragic deaths of the missing tourists, but the tale also reflects the human instinct for survival and the battle against nature. As Death Valley continues to stand as a symbol of nature's unyielding force against humanity, the memory of the missing tourists will not simply be one of a missing persons list, but will remain in history as part of a human story facing the harshest of natural forces. Ultimately, the disappearance of these 4 German tourists is not just a case of vanishing. It is a tragedy that makes us reflect deeply on the struggle for survival and humanity's helplessness against nature. This event serves as an unforgettable reminder of the mysterious, dangerous, and lethal nature of Death Valley, leaving us with a lesson in understanding the battle humans face against nature.